We've just seen a spectacular game between Vidit Gujrathi with the white pieces and Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa with the black pieces. So this game was insane, back and forth, full of blunders, really exciting stuff. Vidit had white here, young Pragg had black, and let's see what happened. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit subscribe to never miss a future video. So we went in for this Nimzo Indian, and Vidit played the classical variation here with queen to c2. So we had castles, pawn to a3, bishop captures, and queen takes back. So in this line, white picks up the bishop pair early on in the game, but you can see the kingside development is lacking. And that's what black often plays against. So we had pawn to d5, bishop to g5 here, and now a really ambitious move from Pragg. h6 is the most common way to play here, along with d takes on c4, but he goes pawn to c5, a really interesting gambit line that he played earlier in this tournament against Richard Rapport. Now Rapport also captured here, and now pawn to d4 is the point. So you kick that queen, queen c2 is an old move here. You can also go queen to g3, that's what Rapport did, but here Vidit goes queen to f3, and both players are very well prepared for this game, we can see. So we had knight b to d7 now, and now pawn to e3 from Vidit, immediately striking at the centre which black is establishing. Now you want to play pawn to e5 here as black, but it's not quite the right timing, because white can capture here, castle queenside, and if you try pawn to h6, which was played in the game, now after captures here, knight recaptures, white has more options because they're a tempo ahead, so they can go queen to f4 for example, pressuring here, coming off this key light squared diagonal which the bishop is looking to develop to. If we compare this to the game, we'll see the key difference here with how Pragg timed this. So he plays h6 immediately. Now you don't want to drop the bishop back to h4 here, it's just a bit too slow in this position. Remember, you're way behind in development here. So captures came on f6, the knight recaptured, and now we had castles queenside. And this position's different because now after pawn to e5, you're a tempo behind here as white, and bishop g4 is coming, you can't sit the queen on f4 like you could in the last position. So white has to deal with this threat. Now if you go pawn to h3, this is too slow because now e4 comes. After the queen moves up to f4, then d3, and you're just getting completely squashed here as we can see. But the subtle difference here between what Vidit plays compared to this is that he goes knight to e2 in this position. And now if you try pawn to e4, queen to f4 and pawn to d3, here the knight has actually developed. So you can jump into c3, pressuring this pawn, and say the queen holds that pawn, the key move here is pawn to f3. You're actually breaking down this structure here. Black is overextended, white's doing well. So that's why the players didn't go down this line. Instead, in this position here, after knight to e2, we had the immediate pawn to d3. You can play bishop to g4 there, which is a move that's been tried. But d3 came, the knight came into c3, and now bishop to g4 came. So this is all getting quite complex, but the players are still in their preparation here. So rook takes d3 was played by Vidit. So the whole point of this is that he counterattacks the black queen. Now you could pick up an exchange here as black. You could take on f3, forcing white to take here. After the rook recaptures and the pawn takes here, yes, you have an exchange as black, but white does have two pawns for that exchange, and it's a kind of dynamic balance here. Who knows who's better? Different game. But this wasn't what happened in the game. Instead, coming back here, black played queen to a5. So white now moved the queen over to g3, and here the game gets a bit more simple to follow. So black picked up the pawn on c5. We had rook d2 dropping back to defend this pawn with the bishop like this. Bishop to e6 renews the threat, and now Vidit had options. So he could have played bishop to e2, goading black into taking this pawn on c4, exchanging it for the e5 one, and the game goes on, white's a little bit better. But instead he plays the really ambitious move, pawn to b4. Not a bad move in and of itself, but you do weaken your king, and this comes back to haunt Vidit down the line, as we'll see. So Pragg had a lot of options as to where to put the queen. He decided to drop it back to c8 here. We had queen takes on e5, and now the bishop took on c4. The king came to b2 here, improving the safety slightly. Pawn to a5 came, naturally trying to rip open lines. Pawn to b5 here. White wants to keep the position closed there. Bishop takes on f1, rook recaptures, and queen to c4. So the queen comes into the danger zone here, and Pragg's looking to go pawn to a4 and get this check in here. So how does Vidit respond to this? Well, he goes rook to c1 first, and after pawn to a4, now he plays knight to b1. All looks a bit strange, but this is his idea. After queen b3 check, then he drops the king to a1, and the knight is holding this crucial a3 pawn, as we can see. So the rook came to the c-file, looks very logical. Vidit exchanged a pair here, the rook recaptured, and now queen f5 came. So this move is dual purpose. It hits the rook on c8, but it also holds this c2 square in combination with the rook, because the rook coming to the second rank is now a deadly threat, of course, that white has to keep an eye on. So queen to c4 now came from Pragg, holding his rook here. We had rook to d4 hitting the queen, and now best was to go queen to c1 here, keeping alive threats of rook to c2 in certain positions, but you do have to watch your own back rank as black, so it has to be timed correctly. But that didn't come in the game. Instead we had the queen dropping back here, and now Vidit has options. He is better in this position. He could have taken the pawn immediately on a4, or g4 was also a really nice try, preparing h4 and a later g5, kicking this knight about. But instead of this, he plays pawn to g3, a tiny bit more passive. Again, now best for Pragg was queen c1, but he goes b6, okay. His moves are slightly limited here. And now Vidit took on a4. But this does allow knight to d7 because the rook's left the d-file. There's no longer a double attack on this square. So this knight's now going to find a much nicer home than what it had on f6. We had rook to e4 here. It covers the knight from coming to e5, but more importantly, if the knight came to c5 here, then rook e7 was prepared. If you take here, then you're losing the rook on c8. And although this is a like-for-like exchange, let's not forget that white is 2 pawns up here, so endgames are good for white. So coming back here, that's why the knight didn't hop into c5. Instead we had g6 kicking the queen, queen f4 was played. Pragg doesn't want to exchange, so he jumped into c5. And now Vidit makes a really bad blunder. He's better in this position, but he has to play rook to b4 and hold this b5 pawn. That pawn is critical because it adds to his king safety. But instead, he plays queen takes on h6, not the right pawn to be snapping off the board. This allows queen takes on b5, and now white's in trouble. To demonstrate the threats here, say you go pawn to h4 for example. Well, knight c5 is just killing it. You hit the rook, you're threatening a deadly check here. In some lines the rook's coming to c2, the whole game is gone. And if you try give mate on the h-file as white, with rook to h4, well then queen e5 check comes. Once again you're running into rook c2 if you shuffle your king up the board, so rook d4 would have to be played there. The whole thing's collapsing. So that's why after this move queen takes on b5, we had pawn to a4, kicking the queen out of the danger zone. And you might wonder about bringing the queen into b3 here, but the problem with this is that the queen now no longer has access to this key dark square diagonal. Now rook h4 really is killing black on the h-file. So that's why instead we had this move with queen into c6. Now with rook h4, you do have access to this diagonal. You can check from f6. So we didn't have rook h4. We had queen to f4. Now knight c5 came. Rook to c4 pins. And now Pragg missed a deadly move to force through a winning sequence. So he could have played rook to a8. hitting this pawn. It's hit 3 times, as we can see. And there's no good way to defend here. If you try knight to c3, well, b5 is just absolutely killing it. The pawn is pinned, the rook is attacked, everything's collapsing. And there are themes of this continuing throughout the game of bringing a piece to the a file. Instead, Pragg goes rook to d8. Vidit drops his rook back to c2. He doesn't mind if black picks up here with the queen and the queens come off. That's a good exchange. He's happy with endgames. So instead, Pragg goes queen to h1. We had queen to b4 now, and now knight takes on a4 is a really nice tactic from Pragg. So if you recapture there, which is actually the number 1 choice by the computer, then you can give this move from afar. Supported by the queen, you don't see that every day, so that you're winning the white queen here, and this should be winning for black. So coming back here, after knight takes on a4, instead Vidit tried rook to d2. Again, rook a8 was most powerful, but rook c8 was played. We had queen to e7 now from Vidit, queen to a8 from Pragg. So he does find this idea of coming to the a file eventually, but with the queen this time. Rook a2 comes to that line, but now pawn to b5 comes. The queen switches back to b4, attacking that pawn, but it's a pseudo threat in this position because after queen h1, if you actually try and take that pawn, then knight c3 comes and you're forking those pieces. So coming back here, instead Vidit tried rook to a3, and now Pragg chopped on h2 here. We had queen to d2 from Vidit, holding this pawn, and Pragg now recycles his queen back into the game. So after pawn to f4, we had queen f5, and Vidit now starts this process of desperately trying to exchange off the queens here, get into an endgame because of his king safety issues. So queen f6 check came, we had queen d4, queen e7, rook b3 now, rook a8 renews these threats against the king, rook a3, rook to d8 now from Pragg, and queen e5, once again trying to get those queens off the board. And here Pragg obliges, so he transitions into this endgame, which is very good for him, but how good is it? Is it winning? There's been so much back and forth this game. What will happen next? So rook e8 comes, hitting this pawn. Rook to b3 attacks this one. We had takes here, and now knight a3. Finally, that knight comes back into the game. Knight c5 now from Pragg, and rook takes on b5 is the only move to stay in the game here. And now some nice calculation from Pragg. So he takes on e3, leaving his knight on prise. You can't take here or we take with check. And after the king moves, we're picking up a second pawn. That's completely winning. So coming back here, after takes on e3, we had knight into c4. Rook e1 check came, king to b2, and now knight to e4 comes, attacking this pawn. So it jumps up to g4, rook e2 check, king c1, and knight f2 now. More pressure on the pawn, it comes to g5. So what's going on here? So black has the extra pawn as we can see, but it's well cramped in this position by the pawn on g5, and it's going to be very tricky for black to make progress when you've got both of these pieces hopping around and the king getting in towards this side of the board. So king g7 now came from Pragg. We had knight to d2 from Vidit. We had rook e8 from Pragg, king to b2 here, and rook to c8 now. A really nice move, chopping the king off from the other side of the board. We had rook to d5 and knight to d1 check. So the king now comes to a3, not where you want your king to be, miles away from the pawn as we can see. Knight to e3 from Pragg, rook to d3 here, knight to c4 check, king b4, and now the knights come off the board, the rook recaptures. So rook endgames can be notoriously drawish at times. What's Pragg got planned here, swapping the knights off the board? Well, rook c1 was played first, keeping the king cut, rook a2 from Vidit, king g8 from Pragg, and rook a8 check. So this is one of the challenges for black. How do you get your king out of this cage in the corner? It's very cramped in, white's got these checks. Well, the issue here for white is that black has always got threats to pick up this pawn. If we imagine the rook coming to say f1 and then f5 in the right situation, and you haven't got a rook g1 move, then that pawn is dropping and the endgame is winning. So this is the challenge for Vidit, trying to keep the king boxed in and hold on to this pawn. So king h7 came, rook a2 now, king g7, rook a5, king f8, rook a7, so cuts the king here. And now king to e8 is a beautiful move from Pragg. You want to keep the black king cut here with the white rook on the 7th, but you've got nowhere to put it. If you come to c7 or d7, you lose a piece. If you come to b7, you also lose to rook b1, picking up the rook. So that's why Vidit had to give ground here, and the king escaped from its cage in the corner. Rook a6 now came, king to e7, and white has the same problem that he can't put the rook on any of these squares or you're running into a losing endgame. So that's why rook a2 was tried, king to e6, rook to a5, rook to f1, rook to a6 check, king e5, and now after rook a5 check, king f4, king c3, king g4, here Vidit chucked in the towel, the game is gone. If you enjoyed this game, then do hit here to subscribe to the channel and see more amazing Tata Steel games, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.